Hey everyone! Today, we're talking about the Crusades, a time when Christian knights traveled to the Holy Land and tried to keep control of it. Since they were used to ruling with the feudal system back in Europe, they set up a similar system in Palestine. They divided the land into different territories, each ruled by a crusader leader. The most important was Jerusalem, which became the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by a famous crusader named Godfrey of Bouillon. 3 other regions were also created, each controlled by a different leader, with crusader knights serving under them. The local people, mostly Christian farmers, were allowed to stay, but they had to pay rent and taxes to their new rulers instead of the Turkish and Saracen leaders who controlled the land before. After capturing Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders wanted to return home. This left Godfrey and his fellow leaders with only a small army to defend their new kingdom. If the Muslim forces had been united, they could have easily taken the land back. But since they were divided and cautious after seeing how heavily armed the Crusaders were, they held back. This gave the Crusaders time to build huge castles to protect their land. More Crusaders arrived to replace the ones who left, and Italian merchants came to trade, helping the Christian territories grow stronger. 3 important military groups were also formed to protect the Holy Land and Christian travelers. The Knights of St. John, Hospitallers, helped take care of sick pilgrims. The Knights Templar were warrior monks who defended Christian lands, and the Teutonic Knights, mostly German fighters, joined in as well. These groups became powerful and wealthy, helping to keep Christian control in the region. For about 50 years things were stable, but then, shocking news spread through Europe. One of the Christian territories had fallen to the Saracens, and many Christians had been killed. Panic spread, and soon another crusade was launched in 1147. This second crusade was led by 2 kings, Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France. They took the same path as the first crusade, traveling through the Danube River, Constantinople, and into the Holy Land. But the journey was brutal. The German army was almost completely destroyed, and even though the French army reached Palestine, they didn't achieve much. After this failed crusade, not much changed for 40 years. Pilgrims and new fighters kept coming from Italy and France, helping the Christian states survive even as many crusaders returned home. But toward the end of this period, rumors spread about a new Muslim leader rising to power in Egypt. His name was Saladin, and he would become one of the most famous figures of the Crusades. Saladin was a brilliant military leader and a wise ruler. What made him different was his sense of honor. He treated his enemies with respect, kept his promises, and remained humble even as he gained power. While the Crusaders believed they were fighting a holy war, Saladin saw his mission the same way. He was determined to take back Palestine for the Muslim world. As his influence grew, he surrounded the Crusader states and prepared for a major attack. One crusader described Saladin's army as an unstoppable wave stretching from Tyre to Jerusalem. When the Christian knights marched out to fight, they were defeated. The king of Jerusalem and the leader of the Templars were captured, and soon, Saladin set his sights on the biggest prize, Jerusalem itself. The siege lasted only 2 weeks before the city surrendered. But unlike the Crusaders, who had killed thousands when they took Jerusalem nearly a century earlier, Saladin showed mercy. Instead of a massacre, he allowed most Christians to leave peacefully after paying a ransom. However, the churches were turned into mosques, and once again the Holy Land was back in Muslim hands. And when news of these events spread through Europe, it caused a huge stir. 3 of the most powerful rulers of the time, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England, decided to launch the Third Crusade in 1189. Each had their own motives, but their shared goal was to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging but battle-hardened German emperor, had already fought in the failed Second Crusade. Despite being 70 years old, he was the first to set out, leading his army along the overland route through the Byzantine Empire. Unlike earlier crusaders, his forces were better prepared, avoiding many of the past hardships. However, the journey was still dangerous. At one point, they clashed with the Byzantine Greeks, but the real tragedy came later when Barbarossa drowned while trying to cross a river in Asia Minor. Without their leader, the German army fell apart. Many soldiers perished in the mountains and deserts or were killed by Turkish forces. Only a handful made it to the Holy Land, but they were too weak to make much of an impact. Meanwhile, Philip of France and Richard of England decided to travel by sea to avoid the harsh land route. From the start, there was tension between them. Philip and Richard were rivals, and Philip didn't seem fully committed to the crusade. He was more interested in securing his power in France. Richard, on the other hand, was eager for battle. Their constant disagreements made it difficult for them to work together. When they arrived, they found that Crusader forces had been struggling to capture the port city of Acre for over a year. Conditions were terrible, soldiers were starving, disease was spreading, and the leaders couldn't agree on a strategy. One Crusader wrote, "The leaders argue while the common soldiers suffer. The Turks attack constantly, while our knights remain in their tents." Despite the chaos, Richard proved to be a brilliant military commander. Using powerful siege weapons like battering rams and movable towers, he led the final assault that forced the city to surrender. Not long after, Philip decided he had had enough. He returned to France, leaving Richard to lead the Crusaders alone. Over the next year, Richard won several battles, showing his skill as one of the greatest warriors of his time. However, despite his victories, he couldn't capture Jerusalem. Saladin, the leader of the Muslim forces, was a master strategist who avoided direct battles that could put the city at risk. Eventually, Richard had no choice but to negotiate a truce. Under their agreement, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit freely. It wasn't the victory the Crusaders had hoped for, but it was the best deal they could get. Before leaving, Richard warned Saladin that he would return to continue the fight, but that never happened. On his way back to England, his ship wrecked, and he had to travel through dangerous lands. He was captured by his enemies in Germany and held for ransom. By the time he was finally released, he was caught up in conflicts in Europe. He never returned to the Holy Land and died in 1199 after being shot with an arrow during a battle in France. After the Third Crusade, later crusades were much less successful. The Fourth Crusade took a strange turn when the Crusaders, manipulated by Venetian merchants, ended up attacking the Christian city of Constantinople instead of fighting in the Holy Land. This severely weakened the Byzantine Empire and put it under foreign control for 50 years, benefiting Venice more than anyone else. Other crusades followed, but they achieved little. The Fifth Crusade briefly regained Jerusalem, but only through a treaty, not by military victory. The Sixth and Seventh Crusades, both led by Louis IX of France, focused on attacking Muslim forces in Egypt and North Africa. Both ended in failure, with Louis captured in the Sixth and dying of illness during the Seventh. For over 100 years after these failures, popes and kings continued to call for new crusades, collecting money and making plans. Some battles were fought in places like Spain, Hungary, and Prussia, but no major armies were sent to reclaim the Holy Land. Over time, people stopped seeing it as a priority, and the idea of conquering Jerusalem faded away. Even though the Crusades failed in their original goal, they had lasting effects on Europe. Crusaders brought back new foods and goods, like sugar, citrus fruits, rice, and fine fabrics such as satin and velvet. The Crusades also changed society. Many nobles, desperate for money to fund their campaigns, freed their serfs and sold town charters, giving cities more independence and weakening the power of feudal lords. Most importantly, the Crusades exposed Europeans to new cultures, ideas, and knowledge. For 2 centuries, people traveled far beyond their villages, learning about different civilizations and ways of life. When they returned home, they brought these influences with them, helping to transform medieval Europe and pave the way for the modern world.